70% of our healthcare is largely driven by chronic conditions. Many of those are the very basic things that we've talked about. And then you add on this layer of truthfully, what does that care economy look like? And you go back to, again, like, what are our preconceived notions? When we started to talk about GDP, we didn't account for work that was done in the home. Meaning, if you are taking care of your aging mother, that does not account for in GDP. Yet the moment that you get an outside care worker into the home, now that's part of GDP. There are a bunch of these disconnects in the way that we've come to measure these different areas. And then when you bring it back to TAM, no wonder we're not always calculating it in a way that's actually truly representative of the opportunity. And so, again, to your question of what have people missed and why hasn't this been a bigger area, it comes back to those lived and learned experience. It comes back to first principles thinking about, is this actually the right data that we should be looking at? How should we be thinking about it further? And then truthfully matching the demographic side and the trends to where we think these industries can go.
Madeline, welcome to the Slice Pod, where we uncover the stories of fresh emerging managers across the early stage venture landscape. You are the managing partner of Kaya Ventures, an early stage fund investing in companies redefining healthcare, specifically women's health and wellness. So let's start where we always do around here, which is by asking, how do we get to this point? Was this always the plan? Were you always going to run your own venture fund at some point?
Gosh, I mean, not at all. For context, I'm one of 13 kids in a blended and multicultural family. I also largely grew up in Australia, despite jumping back and forth. And truthfully, until recent years, venture capital wasn't much of a thing in Australia, and certainly wasn't much of a career to aspire to. My mom was a teacher in the special education system. She taught in juvenile prisons and then in schools where they had kids with special needs. And then my dad, I would call him an environmentalist, but he, in the early years, was out protesting when they had mine projects, very much then went to live with an Indigenous tribe up in North Queensland. And so I would not say that that's the typical pathway towards capitalism in the venture world. But I was really lucky to witness strong leadership from a young age. Both my parents were really involved in the community. My father especially was never afraid to stand for things that he believed in. And so I grew up witnessing that. I think I was really fortunate. As everyone says, you know, it's around how opportunity is distributed. I started undergrad back in Australia on a whim, decided that I would go study abroad. I thought I wanted to be in America, and I was like, what's going to be culturally different? So I picked Texas. It was great that I ended up transferring there. So I did half of school in Australia, half of school at UT. At that time, I had no money. So I had been working since I was 14. My first job was at McDonald's, which, again, does not necessarily set you up on I will one day work in venture capital and start my own firm track. But again, I went from there to then working at Disney. I was an Apple campus rep when Austin was just starting their campus for Apple. And so really had the ability to start to see these waves of technology, the waves of consumer involvement. And then growing up how I did, truthfully, healthcare is so central to people's lives. My mom was part of the Medicaid population, which isn't something most people interact with or understand with. But when I got my first job out of undergrad, I worked at Oliver Wyman, where we have a big healthcare practice. So my first day, I get handed like a 200-page deck of Healthcare 101. And you do need 200 pages to even skim the understanding of what that looks like in the US. It covered Medicaid, Medicare, commercial plans, like what does this world actually look like? As I went on through that career, looking at mergers and acquisitions, thinking about corporate strategy, it was always in the back of my mind, how does this impact us as consumers? How does this impact us as everyday individuals? Where even as someone who went on to get a degree from HBS, I feel like I was still only skimming the surface of an understanding of how to interact with my own insurance, how to access products and services that I needed. Products and services my siblings needed, my parents needed. And then likewise, always really, again, across the spectrum, because I'm part of a really intergenerational family. So I lived with my grandparents when I was in high school, which meant that they were always very close to me. Much later, combining these lived and learned experiences and seeing the world very much from, I would say, a business perspective. After I went to business school, it really set me on this path of, what is the way to make an impact, and how do you make that in a way that's really fueling innovations in the places we'd like to see? I feel like I finally got there, but it was one of those situations where you can only connect the dots in retrospect. I don't think I could have ever done it looking forward.
And what was the aha moment that really got you to the launch of Kaya? Like, what was the catalyst? Was it another client, another
Yeah.
meeting, another flight to a random city in the Midwest? Like, what really pushed you to say, yeah, this is the right thing to do. This is the right moment to do it?
It's funny. I feel like most people, I say this with most people, feel like they dislike their time in consulting, and I strangely didn't. I really liked traveling. I also didn't grow up with any money, so being in a nice hotel where I had a bunch of people to talk to, and honestly, I had a great time. I went to business school thinking I would actually go back, and then did the opposite of everyone else, and I turned down my sponsorship and worked at a first time fund. And so through that experience, really, you get to really be part of building something. And again, people don't often think about building a company when they think about building a venture capital firm, but it really is a startup like so many other companies are, except that, again, there are differences, right? You largely only scale with LA. Your teams tend to really stay small. Your headcount doesn't really grow with success in certain ways. There are a bunch of different attributes, but at the end of the day, it's new company formation, it's new strategy, it's new ways of go to market. And I found that I actually really loved that experience. I loved going from working with Fortune 500s down to companies essentially with, again, barely any revenue, let alone EBITDA. It really opened my eyes to, oh wow, like what would it be like one day to be able to do this with a thesis I was really excited about. And after several years of investing, largely in consumer space, was doing a lot of vertical SaaS in the retail space. Again, areas that I knew really well. But I think there was always part of me that wanted to do something in an area where I thought others weren't investing, where I could make more of an impact, where we wouldn't necessarily just be the seventh person coming around a larger investor. And so that was part of the impetus. One, it was from a category perspective of wanting to invest in sectors that I really believed in. Two, a continuation of that entrepreneurial bug of being one that wanted to push myself and challenge myself. And three, I think that gets to a point where you also want to build something where you can define a culture, where you can build some kind of legacy. So I think that also appealed to me. It was something that built over time. It wasn't necessarily one catalytic moment where something went really well or really badly one day and I was like, that's it, I'm starting my own firm. Certainly over time, a lot of learnings began to capitalize.
When did it start? This year or end of last year?
So I started investing and formed a vehicle in 2022.
Yeah.
It was organic. I had started angel investing. I thought that was an amazing way. And I went the opposite way. Most people start angel investing, join a fund, or start a small vehicle. I did the opposite. Before I was working at a fund. And then throughout the process, made enough money to be an accredited investor myself to begin deploying personal capital, which is kind of a backwards experience in many ways of how people often get into venture. And so I had been institutionally deploying capital and then really wanted to start myself. And so started putting in personal checks. Again, after years, you have friends that leave a company that you invested in before that you really believe in. And similarly to the way that I started Kaya, doing something that's based on their own lived and learned experiences and somewhere where they are really driven. And so essentially I'd started doing SPVs after doing angel checks, continuing to do that, and then was really lucky to get into a few wonderful emerging manager programs, including Recast, which comes with a good sum of working capital backed by Pivotal Ventures. And so that really put us on a pathway to start supercharging it a little bit more. But I would say we also punched above our weight. I often think people think we're a lot bigger than we are. And truthfully, it's largely me, my venture partner, and my EA being really scrappy a lot of the time. So I feel like even though I feel like it's been a while, it still feels like we're at the beginning of the journey most days.
I want to dig a little deeper. You have a very unconventional path to being an emerging manager. I think that most people with your background would end up at a large multi-stage firm, like, helping place like much bigger checks where the rigor of the due diligence that you've learned in your consulting life can get applied to the risk that you're taking on the very big swings. You're going the completely opposite way. It's not normal. As a founder myself and having worked with some really bright consultants that wanted to get into the early stages, there is a part of me that is extremely wary because it rarely works. It's so different. How do you feel yourself about this new life? I would assume it's a lot different from
Yeah.
what your past used to look like?
I tend to zag when others zig, like in the same way that I turn down the safe path of going back to a nice paycheck and a lot more safety. I've been more risk seeking in a lot of my career paths and moves. Before HBS and management consulting, I didn't have the typical pathway. Most people who end up in a business school like HBS or Wharton didn't come from a family of 13 kids growing up in the middle of nowhere, Australia. I think the path probably seems more unconventional because it was never conventional in the first place. I had a great professor who essentially was like, look, if you want to be in investing, think about like these like three concentric circles or like this triangle, geo, sector, and stage. Where do you ground and where are you more willing to be flexible? I was always a people person. Like I always grew up in communities. I always grew up wanting to connect to people. I always grew up really believing in the power of storytelling and movements. I just got drilled into as an analytical person. That was the muscle I really had to build. I did not know how to use Excel when I began. This like lovely guy was sitting next to me. And the first day I was like, wait, how do I like get into the cell without clicking to cell? He's like, you press F2. He's like, you're going to have a really hard time here. And so going from like a first day of that not knowing actually how to click into Excel without using a mouse, I got promoted after my first year and did really well in that world. I'll summarize it in two things. I think people have a lot more capacity than we often give them credit for. I think the expectation is that people start in one area and they will do the same thing. I tend to be someone who's happiest when I get to continue to expand, continue to grow, to continue to learn. I think that growth mindset and capacity is always actually what's driven me further. And the second, like, I think it's really knowing yourself, truthfully. Like, probably would have made more money had I stayed in at least like growth equity, if not private equity, and gone that path. But I don't think it necessarily would have played to my strengths at the end of the day. If I'm going to be really honest with myself, I think I was a fine modeler or like mediocre coder when it came to SQL or Python. And if I was going to actually do really well in something, I wanted to do it in an area where I really think I could spike. And I thought that was much more when it came to people thinking about the future of big ideas and strategy.
So let's dig into that for a minute. You focus on areas like infertility, breastfeeding, menopause, end of life care, primarily female founders that operate in these verticals. What's the opportunities that other people are missing that you are uniquely positioned with your skill set and all of the soft skill that you bring to the table that you see that are overlooked? What are the trends? You're talking about things that are pretty secular. These are not trends. Like, for as long as there'll be humans on this planet, like this vertical should be serviced. Why do you think this doesn't get as much attention as it should, especially at the early stages? I can start to glean a little bit how that background married to this new word can help you. Where do you think this gets to?
I think as any venture capitalist, everyone talks about TAM and where something can go, but we're also quite contradictory, right? Like we talk about needing to invest in big TAMs, and then you see the success of something like Uber, which reached $190 billion in valuation and started with a sub-$1 billion black car market. I think it was close to probably 100 million at the time. And so it comes to believe like, okay, everyone can take a different approach to how they see something that is venture backable. And two, that really comes back to how do we view the data? How do we view that historically? How do we view the future? How do we think about dislocations in markets? For instance, when we think about areas that impact women versus men, we have a difference in reimbursement rates. If you have a surgery with a female specific body part, your surgeon is reimbursed less than a male surgeon. So there is like systematic bias that is built in. That kind of bias within the medical field is also within the venture field. So much of this is anecdotal, but very real. I'm sitting in the seat as a check writer, but I don't really understand what you're doing. I don't really understand why it's a big thing. I think my wife might have something like this and it makes me uncomfortable talking about it. Or I think my daughter might have experienced something like this and it makes me uncomfortable. That's not where people then tend to lean in. I think that is a disservice sometimes to finding alpha in areas like this. You look at the size of something, a condition like endometriosis, And erectile dysfunction has probably gotten 4 to 6 times more funding than an area like that, even though it impacts likely a quarter of the number of people. You can recycle that through different chronic conditions. But 70% of our healthcare is largely driven by chronic conditions. Many of those are the very basic things that we've talked about. And then you add on this layer of truthfully, what does that care economy look like? And you go back to, again, like, what are our preconceived notions? When we started to talk about GDP, we didn't account for work that was done at home. Meaning, if you are taking care of your aging mother, that does not account for in GDP. Yet the moment that you get an outside care worker into the home, now that's part of GDP. There are a bunch of these disconnects in the way that we've come to measure these different areas. And then when you bring it back to TAM, no wonder we're not always calculating it in a way that's actually truly representative of the opportunity. And so, again, to your question of what have people missed and why hasn't this been a bigger area, it comes back to those lived and learned experience. It comes back to first principles thinking about, is this actually the right data that we should be looking at? How should we be thinking about it further? And then truthfully matching the demographic side and the trends to where we think these industries can go. So those are just a few of the reasons, but obviously I'm incredibly bullish on these areas. And I will say it's also kind of wild when you sit in 2025 and realize that we're not further in many of these areas. We're finally getting to an FDA approved male contraceptive. And like, it's 2025. Like, we are finally having a world in which people are like, oh wow, like menopause seems to be paying attention to. It's 2025. Like, how have we not done that in the past few decades? The same goes for areas like infertility. We had a 40% increase in cycles of egg freezing in the past year. Part of that is because it's a low basis, but also coming from a background where I had to look at payer policies, egg freezing is really price elastic. If it takes almost 3 cycles at $20,000 a cycle, that's $60,000 when you come to something like IVF. And if you have a median income in this country of closer to maybe 80K, you quickly understand why that doesn't match well. In states like Massachusetts, where you have coverage, it's 7% in terms of IVF proliferation versus a national average closer to 2 to 3%. So again, super interesting when you start to think about what are the new business models that can open up those pathways. Part of it is scientific, especially in II with choosing embryos, all these different parts of those processes. But part of it is also just business model innovation. How do we make these things more affordable? Or how do we get these things to areas where you can't necessarily serve that consumer yet from a physical clinic?
What does the competitive landscape look like for Kaya, for you? It's crazy to say it looks like a greenfield type of opportunity. Yeah. Gigantic time, underappreciated, underserved. Who else is operating where you are, and how competitive is it?
I think most of the other firms in this ecosystem are very welcoming of others to look at these spaces, to invest behind these spaces, because a lot of the female run firms in this space are largely sub 50 million, certainly sub 100 million. That isn't really large enough to be the only investor in a Series A, leading a Series B, a Series C. And so what this world is, a lot of emerging managers in those early stages, some multi-stage firms that have come down to maybe the seed or the Series A level, likely more the Series A. And then this broader ecosystem, truthfully, of getting healthcare partners with CVCs or foundations who want to look at blended finance in a different way. If we think about a 40% cut of NIH funding, knowing that 98% of our drugs that are covered, essentially, that are cleared by the FDA start in NIH-funded labs, we're going to have a huge innovation gap. We know that to continue both scientific progress in these areas, as well as investment in innovation and startups, we all need to come together and do a lot more, because it's still a pretty low basis of capital coming into these spaces.
Do you see it as like a vertical type of play where there is like a larger fund after graduating in size over time and graduating check size with it? Or do you see it as a more horizontal play where there are like smaller funds, maybe more concentrated type of portfolios that are specific into any one of those areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I think about Kaya as a platform, I would love to see us one day with a growth fund, being able to move with the market to where opportunity is. There's not much growth equity going to the space. There's barely any private equity going to these spaces beyond OBGYN clinics, primary care, and fertility clinics. I think there's a huge opportunity from a product perspective to go across the span as it comes to life cycle and stage. And to that point, I think that also addresses some of the different makeups. Like something that's like a four-wall fertility clinic is really different than an AI solution that sells into that fertility clinic. And so I do think some of that is addressed by vehicles that are a little more stage specific or model specific in terms of what that looks like. I'd imagine we would go more that route versus a same fund size, but like different characteristic of what we're looking to invest in. I tend to think it's more of like, how do we grow with the industry versus how do we split ourselves apart to address different pieces of it today?
Historically, this is a massively underfunded opportunity. And, there's a bunch of outdated biases. There is a bunch of mismatch between the check writer population and where the capital should flow. How have you seen in your experience over the last few months raising this vehicle, the reception on the LP side? Is it similar to what the founder would experience on the venture capital side, or is there a break, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the difference from the founder perspective is that there are firms with specific theses, and venture firms are quite public about what they're looking for and what their thesis is. The LP world, as you know, is quite fragmented, and especially when it comes from the emerging manager perspective, there are fund of funds and folks that focus on emerging managers. I would say that area has shrank over the past couple of years, and I think there is less there than perhaps there was before. And I would say less risk seeking, meaning I think a lot of those groups have now moved towards, let's actually look at a fund two, let's look at a fund three in our emerging manager bucket. And so that's category one. Category two, in terms of families or high net worth individuals, those span a few different ways. They may not always be as cyclical as some other groups. That being said, it's really about like, what about the strategy ties to them? So it's often a either personal experience in one of these spaces or a mother or a daughter, right? Someone in their family or friend unit where they've actually really seen this problem of why is there actually such a lack of innovation in these spaces? Like, why did my loved one have to go through 3 surgeries to find something that should have been obvious? And so I think, again, like in that category, they come to see the TAM through a lived experience, which has really widened their awareness to that space. I would say there is still a disconnect because there are fewer women LPs in many of those conversations. We talk about like the great wealth transfer, and I think that is such an area of growth and opportunity. But as it is today, there are fewer women high net worth that invest in venture than men. And so I think that is also part of it, right? In the same way that we see from the venture world investing in directs. Then I think there's a third bucket of aligned institutions. So again, whether it's a hospital or a health system deploying off balance sheet or a foundation that has a pocket to do venture, I think that's a really interesting and like strategic area. But again, is very specific to institution and also tied to macro to some degree. So I'd say like that's what the landscape has looked like for looking at who is the right LP for an early stage fund, even focused on healthcare, because it has different characteristics. We were also very honest, like it's not defense tech, it's not AI, and it's not cyber. And so you don't pick up the heat of the market in a way that some look to as a trend perspective. But I think you have to look over the longer term of what is the place of this vehicle in the market or in individuals' portfolios. I think that is always the hardest part because there's always the challenge, the temptation, right? Where someone is like, I'm just going to rebrand it. And it's like, we're going to be doing AI for healthcare and defense. Also having to be honest with yourself and true to yourself about what you're looking to build.
Where do you find these founders? Where do the best come from? Is it the network you've built over the years? Do you have any specific sourcing strategies? The beauty of having a more narrowly defined sector of focus is that it's probably easier to build a brand and a name for yourself. But I'm curious, where do you see the best ones gravitate around?
Yeah. The best founder introductions are always those from current founders. Founders either in our portfolio, founders that I've invested in before, founders that I've gotten to know over time, whether it's folks that I went to business school with who started companies or were folks that I worked with earlier in my career. those are always the strongest referrals because I think founders are great at understanding like founder talent, and they know you, they know your thesis, and you often get to talk to them before they're fundraising because it's more of the, hey, like Mads might be really helpful as you're thinking about like early stage formation, or like she's seen a lot in this space. She could be helpful as you're thinking about go to market. And so you get to have an earlier conversation before they're like, okay, I'm raising this round in 3 weeks, and are you in or are you out? It gives you more of an ability to build a relationship there. Apart from that, you get the folks that are later stage investing that want someone like smart and scrappy to diligence something that maybe they want to look at in a year or two from now and just track it over time. You get a lot of referrals from angels who want to invest in these spaces, but also don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do diligence. So you get a lot of referrals from friendlies in the ecosystem. And then I'd say we're quite out there. I talk a lot on global stages around areas in healthcare. And then you tend to get founders that aggregate around those ecosystems too, whether it's a leading health institution, a leading academic institution, or even some kind of global conference like Milken. You get a lot of folks attracted to similar spaces because they're very much learning in connective environments.
How do you evaluate them? It is a narrow space, but like the depth at which some of these ideas may go to can be extremely technical, highly regulated. It's a broad surface. Do you underwrite each and every one yourself? Do you bring in experts? Is it the founder that you tend to look at most? Is it their idea? Is it the market? Is it the dislocation between the market and what needs to be there? What's your approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of the above, right? You have to look at the founder in terms of what is their motivation to be building in these spaces. These spaces are highly regulated, not necessarily the hottest sectors, and the customer life cycles and sales cycles in these spaces are often hard. Is this person really in it for the long term? Knowing that you will wake up every day and the next day will also be hard. What makes you, as a founder, want to come back to this problem to be solved? What is the obsession that you have around building in this space? And truthfully, what other proof points can you see? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've had to build something in health before, but what is the tide of the problem to be solved? And what other life experiences have prepared them to do something quite challenging in this way? I think we look a lot at the market. Like, truthfully, are there 7 other people already building in this space? How do we see fragmentation, competition as it relates to the regulatory environment? I think in many ways, like, regulation in healthcare is super interesting because regulation often opens up opportunities in a way that regulation in other sectors usually closes things down. There's a different dynamic. It's specific to subcategories and areas, but very much in an open mindset of actually like, okay, like what does this mean in the broader context? Like, could this actually be a tailwind versus a headwind? Could this create a moat versus something that creates a barrier? And how do we assess that? From a market perspective, a lot of it is looking at TAM today, but where it goes, a lot of this ends up being substitution and thinking about the broader trend. Should this be a company that isn't women's health specific? Should this be a company that is broadly like, I'll make up an example, but like women athletes tear their ACLs 4 times higher than men. If you look at like FIFA is now doing a study in that area, should you just be focused on ACL tears? It just so happens that women are differently impacted by that. And that makes it a really interesting angle. And so again, there's like all of these different ways that come into like market and approach as you start to size things. And then it really dovetails into what is the business model? Are you trying to sell into employers? And again, this has changed so much. 5 to 10 years ago, selling into employers might have been a really interesting strategy. In today's macro, perhaps less so. Thinking about selling into Medicare Advantage, maybe a few years ago might have been more interesting. We were talking about cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, maybe less so. Thinking about consumer and like D2C, like what does that mean from like the way that trends are? So it's, again, it's not necessarily that we're looking for a specific answer around a business model. We're thinking about like, how is the entrepreneur thinking about that business model today? And what is their cognition of like, we are starting here for this reason, but this is the way we scale. And this is the ultimate prize if we get things right, especially in healthcare. Business models often go through different evolutions. Again, especially when it's a highly regulated environment with a lot of large customers that aren't in the business of taking risk. We're really just trying to get a judgment of how are they thinking about this? And again, it doesn't necessarily have to look like a 5-year model that says, year 1, we're D2C, and this is how much it costs. And year 2, we get these contracts, and this is how it spreads. But like some awareness of what that is. And then ultimately, it's looking for some kind of differentiation. If someone else were to come to the table and want to build this tomorrow, what is going to make this company stand out? What is going to make it different? Which is always, again, a tough a tough thing to answer, but often it does come from team and it comes from the references you do and you start to coalesce around this like spark of this company. And I would last but not least say it often is that gut decision too. Like you wake up the next day and you're like, actually, am I still feeling really strong about this company? Am I still feeling strong about this founder? If I fast forward on some of the investments we've made, whether they've gone right or wrong, you always feel good. Even if the company doesn't necessarily have an outcome that is tremendous, you feel good when you've backed a founder that's high integrity and did everything right, communicated well, and truthfully, like just didn't have the luck of the market trend or didn't have the luck in something that went right, which is really hard to do. I'm a big Annie Duke fan from a decision science standpoint, and it's really hard not to be biased by outcomes.
Or some of the hardships of transitioning into the role of an emerging manager, given your background and lived experiences. Like you said something earlier that I think it's quite telling, kind of like the non-linear is actually the path. There's never been anything else to it. Going from a big consulting firm environment into this very unstructured, uncertain, long-term feedback loop type of cycles. It must be hard even for somebody that is used to hard things. What are some of the things that you did not expect going into it that were harder? And also some of the things that probably were easier.
Weirdly, coming from a structured background, if you're good at creating structure, that's very simple. I am a master of calendar blocking, moving things around, thinking about where we need to be, setting goals, deadlines, KPIs. If you come from a structured background, unless you are used to someone else setting that structure, that can actually be like a very easy thing to flow into. And if you're then someone that likes autonomy, it's like an amazing place to be in. I think the harder things are things you don't control. Thinking, this didn't go the way I wanted it to, and I'm not sure I could have done anything differently. Those are the hardest to live with, because when you come from a background where you've had a high degree of agency and you're used to actually quite being resilient and pushing through walls, when there are things that, again, we don't necessarily control the macro and the cycle. And like, that's tough in venture, because it isn't necessarily that you like didn't do the right amount of diligence or that you didn't do X, Y, and Z. It's just that we're in a cyclical industry. Those are absolutely the hardest things to deal with as an emerging manager, because there's not much that you can do differently apart from change your timing, change your strategy, and just really adapt and live through the market cycle.
Yeah, if you cannot change it, change yourself. You need a lot of patience, especially in the last couple of years. Yeah. You just have to accept it and live through it. How do you keep all your ducks in a row? I know you mentioned you have an EA, you have a venture partner, you're a master at creating structure where there is none, setting KPIs and whatnot. But do you have any special software, any tips, any recommendations for any other emerging manager out there that is going about this on their own, just like you are? And like, the variance of things that you need to kind of keep in check. It's a lot. Yeah. Like talking to lawyers in 1 minute, pitching a founder the other, now jump onto an LP, next thing, it's a podcast. After that, it's like a tax audit. What are some of the tips and tricks that you would share with a fellow emerging manager about making this a little bit more bearable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's systems, processes, and infrastructure. If you build it right and invest time in the beginning, it has cascading rewards. We have a really defined foldering system, whether it's Dropbox or a Google Drive. We have the exact same folder structure for every company we invest in. Everything in those folders should be filled out, from an archive to the memo, to the deck, to the diligence, to questions that we answered, a separate thing for legal, company updates. That folder structure is the exact same for every company we've invested in since we began investing. Similarly, the way we structure all of our legal docs, and again, it's only because of the pain of doing this the wrong way earlier, where it's where's that safe from the company we invested in 5 years ago? Who has that in their email? It's that is chaotic to have to live through. And so anyone who's been through that experience, whether in a startup or in a firm, probably feels some kind of duty to themselves to do something a little bit differently. We use Airtable for a lot of things, which again, you can use any database management system of any sort, but it allows easy sharing. I think my best tip is use whatever your team will use. If that's a Google Sheet, fine. You can do things just fine in a Google Sheet. You can do things just fine in Excel, but you have to make sure that you're actually logging the data. And whether that's you inputting it into Salesforce or inputting it into Google Sheet, that's actually the tool I think actually matters less than the consistency of use. CRMs are rubbish if they are not well utilized. And so again, it's like quality in, quality out is a big thing there. And then I'd say I'm a big time blocker. I think actually if you can switch a little bit less and say, look, Mondays, we have a Monday meeting plus follow-ups on this, and I'm going to time block it. Tuesdays, we're going to do this. And you're never going to stick perfectly to it. Be gentle on yourself, but it at least gives you the prompting of what you need to focus on in different periods of time. And every firm probably has its overarching goals for every quarter. You start to think about from a percentage of time basis, where does that need to shift? Is it 40% fundraising because we're at the beginning or end of a raise? Is it 80%? Is it 50% thinking about follow-ons for our portcos? Is it 50% thinking about new investments? And like, again, it doesn't exactly matter what that split is, but you should be able to know what that split is and whether you're sticking to it. The hardest thing is when you just get into the rhythm of being busy every day and you actually can't tell what you're busy on. That's a bit of the danger zone. And I think that's a very easy place for most emerging managers to find themselves. Everything is always urgent. You stop checking for the importance and you can end up in a tough place, especially from a bandwidth and mental health perspective, if you don't learn to create some barriers and say no to things. So it's a very brief summary in some ways. I would also encourage people to check in every quarter or every month and just really think about like what should they be doing different from a process perspective too, because we're always learning, we're always growing. Just because you set a system up 4 years ago doesn't mean it's a system you should use today.
Love it. Madeline, thank you so much for joining
you.
us and telling us your story. This is great. I'll hope to see you in person soon somewhere like in Marina Del Rey or anywhere else in LA.
You've just listened to another episode of Slice Season 2, the podcast for emerging managers. If you enjoyed this episode with Madeline, make sure to subscribe to our Substack not to miss any future episodes. And special thank you to Talal for introducing us to Madeline. We'll see you next time. Bye!